I'll go quick on some things.
All right. Good morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce Nicolas Christin, who's the Associate Director of the INI, and is also a research scientist in ECE and CyLab. And one interesting fact about Nicolas is that he's from France, as you know, but he doesn't eat cheese. So that's pretty rare for the French. And so I guess that's why they sent him here to the US. And it's maybe similar to my story. I'm Swiss and I'm always running late, so they said, go elsewhere. So I guess that's why we're both here. Also, he was mentioning that the microphone makes him feel like he wants to sing a Britney Spears song. So it may. So maybe if we clap enough at the end, he'll sing something for us. But for now,
perhaps not.
For now, I'm looking forward to his talk on online crime.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. And owing to the beautiful weather, I will not sing, I promise. The research I'm going to talk about today is kind of my night job. By day, I'm the Associate Director of INI. I teach classes here, and I also help the students. And by night, I fight online crime. But instead of wearing a colorful cape or some questionable underwear, I instead spend a lot of time trawling dubious websites. So if you look at my browser history, it's actually pretty seedy. The research that I'm going to present today is actually the fruit of about a year and a half to 2 years of work, and I was not alone, of course. My students and my associates need probably to take most of the credit. There are two groups, essentially, that have been working on this, both affiliated with me. One in Japan with Sari Yanagihara and Keisuke Kamataki, who actually was here. And one in Pittsburgh with Nectarios Leontiadis, my PhD student in EPP, along with a colleague from Harvard. So the premise behind this research is that, oops, okay, let me just restart the slides because sometimes it does that. The premise behind this research is that we are trying to understand how we can better model attackers. As security researchers, we've been somewhat trained to think that attackers are omnipotent. When you try to design a secure system, you try to think about what is the worst possible thing that could happen. What if the attacker is so powerful that they can completely own the network, that they can monitor and eavesdrop communications at will? And that's an extremely good model when trying to design secure systems. But it does ignore a very important facet, which is that attackers in practice are rational. So I'm going to set aside for now the nation-state adversaries that we sometimes have to consider, for instance, in the context of military security, to consider instead attackers, run-of-the-mill attackers that we see on the internet, on what I would call the civilian internet. These attackers, by and large, are financially motivated. They are not in here because they really want to own your data, but they want to make a few bucks. And that's the reason why there's a number of attacks ranging from phishing to social engineering scams to Nigerian scams and so forth. Those are all financially motivated, which is pretty good for us because financially motivated people tend, in general, to be economically rational. That is, in general. So ignoring that may lead us to not necessarily devise the most effective defenses. We may be able to devise extremely effective defenses against that extremely powerful attacker, but we would neglect the more common case of the rational attacker. So the idea is, of the whole line of research that I'm doing, is that economics can definitely tell us which intervention strategies are probably the most likely to succeed. So it helps us prioritize between different defensive strategies. Usually, as defenders, we don't have an infinite budget. We have to decide how to allocate our resources. And to be able to do that, well, we first need to understand how attackers operate. So we need to have economic models of attackers. And that's the purpose of this research. Now, an equally important question is, how do you model defenders? Defenders are also usually rationally economic actors, but that would take us far beyond this talk. And that's actually more closely related to the other talk that I gave at CyLab, I think, last year. So it's basically a story for another day. Today, I'm just going to focus on the attackers. This research inscribes itself into a fairly large body of work. So measuring cybercrime, which is kind of the overarching thing that I'm talking about today, usually is done in one of three manners. Some perform passive monitoring of advertised commodities, and I think the first academic paper on measuring cybercrime, which was actually done partially here by Adrian Perring and Jason Franklin, was using this technique. You look at what's being traded on underground channels, and based on that, you build a model for how bartering and trading takes place. Other people have done similar studies with web forums, but one somewhat unfair criticism of this research is that, well, you're not directly participating in those exchanges. So how do you know that commodities that are being advertised are actually sold at the price being asked? And that's a somewhat valid point, but it's not easy to solve it unless you actively participate into an online exchange, meaning you work undercover and you purchase some of those commodities, or you help the miscreants to sell those. And that brings us to a second area of research on botnet infiltration and other related works, like I'm saying web server operation here. There was a paper at WISE last year where people actually ran a pornographic website for about a year and measured a number of things about their users' behavior. That active participation in online exchanges is usually fairly hard to do. It also poses enormous ethical challenges because you either have to participate into a illicit transaction, or you have to facilitate one. No matter how you cut it, it's fairly difficult to do from an ethical standpoint. And the third axis is to do data mining on publicly available data. So for instance, phishing websites, typo squatting websites. Perhaps the most famous study of the kind is the paper by Provost and al., which was published at Usenet Security about 3 years ago, on malware distribution, where essentially they just looked at websites that were appearing in the Google search results and drew some interesting inferences between the different types of sites that are giving you malware. We fall into the green category, so we are here. We didn't participate actively or even passively into any types of illicit exchanges, but we did collect large amount of data that were all publicly available, and we drew inferences to try and build some models of how attackers operate. So the way I'm going to present this is actually presenting two related but different studies. And the first study is about a scam that is pervasive in Japan. And in fact, I was reading the other day that this type of fraud is still continuing in Japan and is still, very popular despite a number of strategies by both the police and the legislator to try to curb them. It's called one-click frauds, and I'm going to discuss in just a minute what it is. This was published at CCS last year. The second type of attack that I'm going to talk about are search redirection attacks. And those are essentially fairly advanced search engine optimization, or I should say search engine manipulation, because optimization tends to denote a loadable goal, which is not necessarily the case here. That paper is currently under submission. You can ask me for the technical report. I will be happy to send it to you. We haven't put it on the CyLab website yet because it's under review. But the paper exists and has been around for a while. There's another paper that I'm not going to talk about, but which is somewhat related to the topic of my presentation today, which we published at NSPW last year. So let me start with the one-click fraud study. It's the Japanese cousin of the scareware scams, if you will. What's a scareware scam? Well, you're browsing on the internet, and all of a sudden, you've got a pop-up window that jumps in front of you and tells you, your computer has been infected. Please click here if you want to disinfect it. Otherwise, you will suffer a horrible death within 28 seconds. Well, that's somewhat similar. When I'm saying it's a cousin, it's because there are some differences. First of all, these scams, so you have a pop-up window, that part is similar, but the difference is that usually this occurs when you're browsing pornographic websites or mildly erotic websites, hence half of the title of my talk. What happens is that you click on a link, and you get a pop-up window of this kind. I'm sorry, it's a little bit blurry, but what it says essentially is, thank you very much for your patronage. You just registered for our premium services, and you owe us $500. You didn't register for anything. You didn't give your name. You didn't give your address. You didn't give any consent. You just clicked on a link, possibly on an SMS link, actually, because they also have SMS variants of those. So you're being told that you just entered a legally binding contract. And what this part here says is essentially to acquit yourself of the debt that you just contracted, you need to send some money to a given banking account, which is given here. So essentially, you have a callback number for the miscreant where you're supposed to deliver the money. The reason why this is done so is that in Japan, credit cards are not as, they are as pervasive as in the United States, but the fees tend to be a lot higher than here. So people still favor wire transfers. The other advantage for the miscreant and for the victim, actually, in that specific case, is that this can be done completely anonymously. You print this out, you go to your 7-Eleven, you pay in cash, and they will do the transfer to this account. So why would anybody pay for this? I mean, it sounds completely egregious that someone just out of the blue asks you for money and you're expected to pay. Well, they tell you that legal action will be taken, and they do so in a fairly convincing manner. So what you see on the screen, or what you don't see on the screen because the font is a little bit too dark, is that it's using, fairly direct language telling you that your contact information has been recorded, we know where you live, we know which browser you run, we know your IP address, and I don't think that this screen shows it, but in the most elaborate variants, they do a geo-IP location, so they look at where the IP address is from, and they tell you, you live in Tokyo, or you live in Pittsburgh, and we know your address. They don't know your address. They know the address of your service provider, but they don't know who is connecting to the site. They also tell you which operating system you run and so forth. As anybody who has done 5 minutes of Perl knows, this is information that is trivial to just spit out on the screen. Doesn't mean that they have any information, but they make you believe that they do, and most people fall for that. The other thing is that what they tell you, I think, in that part, is that if you don't pay immediately, they will have to, unfortunately, send you a reminder. And that reminder will take the form of a postcard, which is displayed here. I had to pixel it out because it's not appropriate at this time of the day, but it's basically an obscene picture. So you can think what is going through the mind of somebody who is not necessarily technologically inclined. Most customers of these websites are middle-aged salarymen who are at home after a long day at work, or who are at work after a long day at work and getting really bored before going home. So you have two solutions. Either you receive, if you believe that you can receive that postcard, either you're going to receive it at home, and your wife is probably not going to like that very much. Or you're going to receive it at work, and your boss isn't going to like that very much either. So people think, okay, well, this is probably pretty bad. This is pretty scary. You know what? I'm just going to go downstairs to the 7-Eleven down the street. I'm going to pay my $500, and this is going to go away. Now, an interesting feature, which I think I need to go back to the previous slide to show you, is, no, we don't have it here, but in a lot of those scams, you actually get a phone number with the scam, in case you have customer complaints. That's interesting. You would say, why do they leave us a calling card? I mean, are they really that stupid? Do they want us to be able to run after them? No. This is something like usually a forwarding number that sends all calls to another phone number that you don't have access to. And when you call them, they tell you, well, We are absolutely sorry about the inconvenience. Indeed, it's a mistake. You shouldn't have been charged for that. Let us remedy the situation. Could I have, please, the honorable customer's name, address, and phone number? And then you can guess what they do with that. Then they do send you the postcard if you don't pay. All right, so it's amusing, but what's the research question behind this? Well, what we were really interested in finding is whether or not these people exploit some glaring weaknesses in infrastructure, meaning are there banks that are more prone to abuse than others, or are there service providers that turn a blind eye to this? And the second research question that we wanted to investigate was whether this were just a bunch of loosely coordinated people doing these scams, because there was quite a rash of these scams, or was there some structure possibly involving organized crime? And so that's what we set out to answer. The offshoot of the research is that once we complete this, we should be able to understand a little bit better how we can address the problem. So we started by collecting a large number of these frauds. And as much as I wanted to, we didn't have to browse pornographic websites to do so. There's a number of vigilantes whiteboards, BBSs of sorts in Japan, where people actually report on those scams. And what we did was we perused these BBSs, and I'm listing 3 of them here. They are basically the 3 biggest ones. And we collected all of the information that they had reported between 2006 and 2009. That's about 2,000 frauds that we were able to collect. They were posted over a period of 3 years. The interesting thing is that you could say, well, maybe some of these guys are just slandering competing websites and posting that on those vigilantes blackboards. We didn't find any such evidence. We actually randomly picked a number of these sites and actually manually went there and confirmed that indeed there was a fraud going on, exactly of the same kind as what I showed you. So the difficulties is that some of these websites are very structured blogs, and that's very easy to extract the information that we want to extract, and some others are just bulletin boards where people just post stuff in some sort of free form. So here we have an example of a fairly structured post. Even if you don't speak Japanese, you can see that this breaks down fairly nicely into a various number of attributes, which is what we want to parse. But in a number of cases, you get text like what's at the top, and you have to extract whatever you can from there. So there was a little bit of data mining complications that we had to go around to extract this data. And so that included quite a lot of cleanup after the fact, making sure that we parsed correctly. What do we collect? We collect the URL of the scam. We collect the bank account number. We collect the bank account name, although this turned out to be useless because most of them are fake. The bank branch name, the bank name, the phone number, and the required fee. And based on that, we can also derive some secondary data, such as the registrar information. We just look up the WIS information for the site. Or we can see what's the canonical DNS name of the server that's running this. So in terms of results relating to the possible weaknesses in the infrastructure, we actually didn't find anything glaringly obvious. We did notice a disproportionate amount of Tokyo numbers. And you may think, well, Tokyo is not exactly a village, so that makes sense. But actually what we figured is that there's quite a lot of these numbers that were used by phone forwarding services. So essentially it's a service. You pay $8 a month for it. They give you a number, and it's just a pass-through that redirects to your cell phone or to something else. So essentially you purchase a number. Think of it a little bit like a Google Voice type of account. Okay? So that's used as a proxy, and this is done so that these people can just hide behind an anonymity proxy. We'll go back to this in a few minutes, but in Japan it's actually very hard to be able to trace back the owner of a phone number because there's very stringent privacy laws. Bank accounts, we didn't see any smoking gun. We just noticed that internet banks are seemingly easier to abuse because there was a much higher number of internet banks in the scams, appearing in the scams, than their market share should warrant. And that kind of makes sense because, producing a forged driver's license is a lot harder than lying on the web. And some of these registration processes, particularly with the earlier scams, 2006, 2007, were not very strong. What we noticed, which was very interesting, is that there's a number of DNS registrars and specifically a number of DNS resellers that are completely turning a blind eye to this. There was a disproportionate number of frauds being hosted at a website whose name you can't read, but I'm going to tell you it's mydo3.com. And we were curious why. Are these people actually engaging in fraud, or are they just being abused? I don't want to prejudge the potential illegitimateness of what they do there, but what I can tell you is that they don't check at all with registering websites with them. And I can tell you that because we registered a domain, actually not a domain, we actually purchased web space under the name George W. Bush, and our address was a metro station in Tokyo. It went through without a hitch. All they needed was a payment. As soon as they had that, George W. Bush or Mickey Mouse could have registered that site. So that part was actually a little bit, I wouldn't say disappointing, but it didn't completely satisfy us. The second question that we tried to answer were, okay, do we see some correlation between different frauds? So what we are going to do is that we're going to try to examine in different frauds if they share bank account numbers, if they share phone numbers, or if they share DNS information. And that's going to help us cluster those different frauds into groups. Formally, this is what we do. We have a number of nodes, and each node is one attribute that we've passed. Yes?
Sorry, this bank...
Can you press the button so that people can hear you?
Is the bank account the account number that the website tells the user to pay to?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it is. It is. So it's the bank account number of the miscreant, essentially. The fraudster has set up a bank account and they want to receive the monies there. So what we're doing here is that we're going to connect the URL of the website with the account IDs and the phone numbers that are being displayed. Again, the phone number is the phone number of the bad guy. I know it sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but they give you a phone number so that you can reach them. Each of the attributes that we've passed is going to be a node in a fairly large graph. And we are going to build the edges just by connecting URLs to account IDs when they are being identified as being part of the same fraud. So that's the first thing that we do. And for the set of nodes that I was presenting on this screen, which was a subset of the total graph, we see already several clusters emerging. Now, if I also link the phone numbers in those bank accounts, the entire set of nodes that were present on the screen collapses into one single cluster. That means that there's essentially one organization running all of these frauds, all of these guys. And so when we run this over the total graph, what do we see? Well, we see that there's at most, because we think that the clustering is fairly conservative, at least 105 organized criminal groups behind all of these frauds that we gathered over 3 years, behind those 2,100 some frauds. On average, each group maintains about 4 websites, 5 bank accounts, and 1.3 phone numbers. That's average numbers here don't work so well because what we observe is that we have a zip distribution. So let me explain this a little bit better. We plot on the left-hand side, as a function of the popularity of the group, the number of sites that they operate. Popularity is defined by a rank. The group that operates the most websites is assigned ranked 1. The second largest operator of websites is assigned a number 2, and so forth. And what we see is that it drops off very quickly, right? So what that tells us is that a few guys are controlling a vast majority of those frauds. And so on the right-hand side, I'm plotting, or actually my student was plotting, a cumulative distribution as a function of the number of groups of the number of sites that are being operated. There are 2 types of clustering here. The red curve denotes basic clustering, which is what I was discussing on the previous slide. Just 1 second, please. And the green line is when we also correlate with information. Now, who is information for these sites is completely bogus. They're not going to tell you who they are. But sometimes the bogus names that they use are actually the same from one group to the next. So that allows us to cluster a little bit more. The results are not noticeably different, but the main takeaway from this is that First of all, as I mentioned earlier, this seems to follow a zip flow, which means that there's a high concentration but a long tail, meaning a few guys are operating most of the sites, but many people are trying, and most people are incompetent. The other thing that it tells us is that about 8 groups run 50% of all scams. Yes, you had a question?
Yeah, sorry. So did the clustering show a lot of overlap in terms of membership, like indications that these groups are collaborating with each other or sharing material?
No, so the clustering that we did here was essentially trying to figure out who is using the same bank accounts or the same phone numbers. Sharing bank accounts seems to really indicate existence of very strong business relationship. I mean, unless you're very, very confident, remember, you're dealing with scammers also. We're not the most honest people on earth. So you really need to have a tight business relationship with the other person. Is it the same person or not? We can't say for sure. What we can say is that they're sharing a bank account and they're sharing banks of phone numbers. One thing that we looked at and that I didn't discuss is whether or not we could see existence of call centers that would kind of, outsource to miscreants. That would be indicated by nodes representing phone numbers with a very high degree. We didn't see that. We just saw that they were reused. That's it. So what are the takeaways from this? Well, the takeaway is that there was large concentration, and this is something I'm going to go back to in a second in the other study. But the point also is that we actually ran a fairly quick economic analysis, and it's extremely profitable. If you want to start one such operation, you're going to break even as soon as you operate roughly 4 sites, and you get 4 users to fall for your scam per site. So about 16 idiots falling for this per year, you're already breaking even. And that explains why, when we looked at police records and few people got arrested and got sent to jail, some people were making millions of dollars of this. And these are actual amounts because they had access to the banking accounts of these people that they arrested. One group of 5 made $6 million from this. That's pretty impressive. Got me thinking maybe I should switch jobs. Because you could say, well, okay, potentially they make a lot of money if they know what they're doing, but there's probably some fairly harsh penalties. That is not the case. Most of these people who got arrested got between 0 and 2.5 years in jail. 0 is a lawyer. Yes, a lawyer was partaking into that scam, got arrested, and successfully argued that what he was doing was nothing more than glorified panhandling. It is a non-profit organization, kind of like NPR, if you will. And that worked. I mean, they actually said, given the legal status in Japan, this was not blackmail because he never sent any postcard. If he had sent a postcard, for instance, if he had gotten address information and sent a postcard, that's different. That's blackmail. That can land you in jail for 10 years. But if you don't do that, if you just ask very, very nicely, can you send me $500? It's actually fairly hard to say that a crime was committed. The other thing is that who's going to report on those things? Usually victims are not going to report on this, okay? So if there's no plaintiff, it's a little bit harder to actually say, well, somebody has been defrauded. The largest fine, interestingly, was $20,000 US. So $6 million in profit, $20,000 in expected losses. I'm definitely considering changing my line of business. So quickly, what did we learn? We learned that there's a lot of concentration. We learned that there is this sort of lottery phenomenon where a few people make actually quite a lot of money, and that entices a lot of people to try their luck, but they don't do it very well. And we didn't notice anything particularly glaring in terms of weaknesses in the infrastructure. So that's the first lesson from this talk. Concentration factors. Let's see if we can see that in a completely different context. So I'm switching now from pornography to drugs. Nice, for a lunchtime talk, that's, I guess, pretty appropriate. So what we wanted to see here was trying to understand where online sales of Viagra, of Cialis, and so forth are going. And the reason why we focused on drugs is that we could have focused on counterfeit software. We could have focused on fake watches. We could have focused on anything else. But this is potentially one of the most dangerous security problems that we face. If you order Percocet, for instance, and the dosage is completely wrong, you can die. And that actually happened to a kid named Ryan Haidt, who has posthumously a law named after him to actually try to control the trade of prescription drugs over the internet. So the idea is that forget spam. No one sees spam anymore. I'm being a little bit exaggerating here, but spam filters are doing now such a good job that you really have a hard time getting customers just by spamming people. It's a nuisance for internet service providers. It's a nuisance for email providers. But for end users, I don't see that much spam coming to my inbox. Most of it is in my spam folder. So spam has a very, very low conversion rate. It's been shown in a couple of studies. And the reason is it's unsolicited. It's like junk mail that you get from the post. You usually don't even read it. You just throw it away. Now, spammers have somewhat adapted. I mean, they realized that this is not working very well. So they've been moving to more targeted content. So for instance, one recent study at CCS last year, actually, was showing that spammers are increasingly moving to Twitter. And the reason is, if I'm following you and you seem to be advertising a product, I'm much more likely to click on that link. And the interesting thing is that people who get, whose account get hacked and have, miscreants posting links to other sites, usually they don't care. As long as they can continue posting, some people didn't even realize that there was a problem. They were like, oh, I thought it was part of the Twitter service that they posted spam as part of my tweets. So here the idea is to exploit trust that we have in our online friends. But what I'm going to focus on in the next 10 minutes or so is search engine manipulation. Here, it's very different. Instead of blasting spam to people, you're waiting for them to come to you. So you're trying to position yourself by answering to search engine inquiries. For instance, if I'm actually looking for Viagra without prescription, and you, the attacker, you manage to prop your results high enough so that I see them, it's the first thing I see on Google, then there's a good chance that I'm going to go visit your website. Why? Because I'm interested in the product. I'm requesting it. And that makes it also interesting because what we're going to talk about is essentially a victimless crime, right? I mean, the person who is looking for scoring drugs without prescription, that's not exactly, knight in white shining armor. So the idea is to inflate the position in search results of an online store. And the way this has been done recently is through search redirection attacks. So I'm going to try to show you a very quick video showing how this works. And this was done about a month ago. I was trying to get some Cialis. So I'm running on Google, no prescription Cialis. It's a little bit small, but the third link here is www.something.cs.umass.edu. I didn't know that the University of Massachusetts actually sold Cialis, but apparently they do. Now you will notice that the URL is actually completely different. So what happened? Well, let's cut and paste that URL. I mean, is the site have completely compromised? Not really. I cut and paste this URL, and I go to the website directly as if I wasn't coming from Google. And this is actually a networking and distributed systems research group, who obviously needs to hire a systems administrator. This is not limited to the query that I just ran. I was not very inspired, so I was really looking for Cialis, but you can try it with Percocet, Viagra, anything. And you will see that some sites sometimes are marked as compromised by Google. Google will tell you something may be fishy. Yeah, I mean, it's cgi.media.mit.edu. And that is why you're at Carnegie Mellon and not at MIT. You go there, and you've got those 3 handsome doctors telling you that they can solve all of your problems. Now, if you go to the site directly, and I'm going to interrupt this because we don't have so much time, but it doesn't do anything. It's actually a repository for scripts that the Media Lab at MIT is using. So what's going on here? I mean, it's somewhat weird that those sites have a different behavior depending on whether or not you're coming from Google. Well, what happens is that there are 3 things that happen. First, the attackers has managed indeed to compromise those sites. And they've been able to do so in a way that leads them to be present in the search engine results. Now, if you click on one of those infected results, cgi.media.mit.edu, which I think has been cleaned up, by the way, since I did that experiment, you're going to land, indeed, at cgi.media.mit.edu, but your request is going to be intercepted by a small piece of software that the attacker has injected. And if it notices that you're coming from Google with, in the referrer terms, you have something like Viagra or Vicodin or whatever, it's going to send you to another website by issuing an HTTP 302 redirect. After one or more of those 302 redirections, you're going to land on the final pharmacy store. Now, if you go directly to the website, not from Google, so your HTTP referrer terms do not include Viagra, they do not include Vicodin, the piece of code is going to look at this and say, okay, that's a legitimate request, and just displaying the normal contents of the website. The reason why they do this is so that those websites cannot be traced easily as being compromised. Unless you run those queries, you don't see that you've been hacked. There's nothing that's particularly obvious about it. So the way this is done is usually by exploiting some blogging software or some wiki software. Even though the website that I showed you earlier of this research group in Massachusetts wasn't apparently running any wiki, they probably had some wiki running in the background that they were not using, but somebody else was. Those redirection chains are usually broken down. Well, we can break them down into three different parts. The source inspection, the redirectors, which are nodes that do not do anything except send 302 redirects to different sites, and the online pharmacies. So you have a whole network of these things that we can try to interconnect to get more information about those supply chains. The way we collected this is by essentially abusing Google for now about a year. Every day we are running 218 drug-related queries. I don't have time to go into the details why those 218 and why not 219 or 212, but I can do that during the Q&A session if you're interested. Those queries, we get the first 64 search results from Google. So that's the first 6 pages of results for each query. So that gives us an adequate coverage, we think. We identify all the results that perform automated redirection, and then we go visit them. Okay, so that we can build this entire graph. Now, the first set of results that we think are relatively interesting. So we got a total of about 137,000 responses to all of those queries ran over, that was over the first 6 months. Out of those, more than half are infected results. Okay, so Google is definitely being abused here. What's actually more impressive, I think, is that out of those 73,000 infections, so sites that are completely unrelated, like MIT.edu or Notre-Dame.edu or what have you, there were still 44,000 that were active, meaning they were actually redirecting to an online pharmacy. The others, they were probably cleaned up, but still, that's about 1 result in 3 was infected over 6 months. Legitimate pharmacies, 12 out of 6 months. We got 12 results for CVS or Walgreens or such. So that's completely negligible. Those results are completely drowned out. Now you might wonder, okay, well, that's fine, but you told us that you collected 64 results per query. What if all the legitimate results are the first 2 results, the top 2 results on Google, and then all that junk is at the bottom of the 6th page? That wouldn't be a big problem, would it? Well, what we noticed is that we see pretty much the same thing independent of the search position that we are considering. What this graph means is that among the top results in response to those queries, that's the first line, label number 1, about 20% were active search redirection attacks. Another 10% or so were search redirection attacks that had been cleaned up, but Google still had those results. The blue ones are blog and forum spam. As you can see, there's still quite a lot of spam going on. Red one are illicit pharmacies that are directly advertising on Google. And the green thing are actual legitimate health resources. So as you can see, for the top results, in response to those queries, you have less than 15% of actual legitimate results. And this is the same thing is true whether you look at the first result, the second result, or stuff on the second page. So there isn't a big difference. Yes?
What constitutes a legitimate result if you're specifically searching for illegitimate things?
That's a good question. What constitutes a legitimate result if you're searching for illegitimate things? The point here is that a legitimate result would be, I guess I used legitimate a little bit loosely. I would say something that doesn't break the laws, for instance, would be good. I'm not claiming that Google should perform censorship, but they actually do not like that very much because a lot of these businesses are actually advertising goods that shouldn't be imported in the United States, for instance. The other thing is that a number of those queries actually are not specifically targeting illicit stuff. No prescription Viagra, yes, that's pretty much, somebody is trying to abuse the system. But there are some other queries that we used which could have been innocuous. Some of the people who run these queries actually do so because they don't have health insurance and they want to get, fairly cheap drugs as opposed to paying $2,000 or $3,000 for a drug. So the end customer is kind of in a gray zone, right? I mean, some of them are running definitely queries for stuff that they shouldn't be trying to buy online. Some other queries were less in the illegitimate side. So let me show you a couple of other results before concluding. This doesn't seem like it's slowing down. So here on the x-axis, I'm plotting the date. On the y-axis, I'm plotting the number of domains that we see, number of new domains that we see each of this month. And the black curve, which is increasing, tells us that, well, search redirection attacks are increasing. So this is definitely where the action is taking place. Spamming, on the other hand, completely decreased over the 9 months that we looked at. It actually decreased by 50%. So blog and forum spam, people start to think, you know what, I might as well run a search redirection attack. And the rest is pretty constant. Now, the most astute readers will notice that we have a 2-month gap here. Nothing weird is happening in that gap. It's just that we didn't have time to stitch the results. They're in a different database. We didn't have time to stitch them back into this figure, but you have my promise that there is no weird spike or anything that we cannot explain here. Actually, they're just continuing, but I didn't have time to finish that graph. Another thing that's interesting is that infections last very long. The mean time, I think, is about 50 days. So when a site, such as cgi.media.mit.edu, I like to pick on them for whatever reason, when a site like that gets infected, it takes the systems administrator about 2 months and a half, about 2 months, to clean up the act. And we observe this over various domains and various page ranks. I don't have so much time for this. I think the more interesting part is that we again tried to uncover a relationship between the different search results. And what we did was to plot a graph, a little bit similar to the one-click fraud graph that I presented earlier, where the nodes are websites and the links between the nodes denote redirections that occur. And so the idea was, well, we're going to do that, and we're going to have like 6 or 7 clusters, and voila, that's going to be our 6 or 7, pharmacy operators, and we're going to be able to give that to the FBI, and they will go there, they will arrest everybody, we will be in the New York Times, we will be very famous, happy end. Except that when we did this, this is what we got. And this graph is so unimportant that I'm putting it, in small on the side. I'm a little bit ashamed. Because what we noticed is that everybody is connected to everybody else. 95% of those sites were connected to some other guys. So that was a little bit disheartening because we didn't realize that everybody was that connected. So does that mean that there's only one pharmacy operator behind all of this, or does it mean something else? Well, we don't know. What this shows is that there's definitely a lot of interaction between operators of different sites. And it's been described somewhat informally in some of the antivirus literature, actually, that there are some evidence of affiliate networks where people are acting as traffic brokers for different entities. And we think this is the reason why everybody is connected. So we took that big giant cluster in the middle, and we started to run clustering algorithms on it. So again, all the nodes are connected, but maybe some are connected more to other nodes than some other parts. So this is what we ran. We run a clustering algorithm called the spin glass algorithm, and essentially what it does is, in a given graph, it identifies subgraphs that are tightly connected to each other. So for instance, if you have 5 nodes that are fully meshed with each other, connected just to another group of 5 nodes, it's going to identify the 2 groups as distinct. When we run this on the big cluster in the middle, we produce that beautiful, lovely, colorful graph, which tells us that there's essentially about 12 large clusters, each denoted by a different color. Then we actually thought, okay, well, that's nice. That's a nice algorithm to run on this. What does it tell us? So we looked specifically at some of these clusters. And what we noticed is that, for instance, among all of those purple nodes here, they are all hosted at the same autonomous system, which is interesting. May mean that there is a registrar that is, a DNS reseller that is, or an internet service provider for that matter, that is crooked, or at least not checking anything, like in the case of the one-click frauds. Some of these other guys showed very high concentration. They were all linked. And so what we noticed is that there are 2 ways of interpreting those clusters. One way is that some of them are operations run by a single individual. Some others may have been run by several individuals, but they're part of the same campaign. They all occurred at the same time, and they were targeting the same type of drugs. So that gave us confidence that we managed to identify strong business relationship between people within the same cluster. I cannot be as confident in these results as I was with the one-click fraud. I cannot tell you there are 12 people who operate these things. But what I can tell you is that there are 12 groups or 12 campaigns that clearly have played an important role in this. And then maybe we can investigate a little bit deeper each of these groups. So before I finish, we wanted to run a small, quick economic analysis here. And I don't have that much time to detail it. It's very approximate. But essentially what we try to get is an idea of the conversion rates. Conversion rates means you divide the number of people who actually completed a purchase divided by the number of people who viewed the website. We know that for spam, it's 10 to the minus 7 or 8. Okay, so it's very, very small. For Twitter spam, it's 0.something%, 0.1% in the best case. Here, our back-of-the-envelope analysis tells us that it's somewhere between 0.5 and 5%. So it's much higher. We don't have the exact number, but qualitatively we can determine that it's much higher than what we observe for spam or for other forms of online crime. And this is done by using a combination of our measurements with traffic estimators provided by Alexa and Google AdWords. So we are using, again, public information for this. If we want to have an actual, really precise conversion rate estimate, we actually have to get into one of those sites and start monitoring traffic passively. So we would have to hack into one of those sites, which is interesting future work that we're actually considering. But again, it poses some ethical challenges because you probably want to notify, person that they are not engaging into questionable things. And so we'll see where that goes. But what I can tell right away today is that the lower bound estimate that we have of 0.5% of conversion rate is much higher than what's been observed for other scams. So what can we do? Well, we can try to disconnect those networks. Okay, I mentioned that there are some clusters that are fairly highly connected. And we just look at the in and out degree of all of those nodes in the graph. And what we notice is that there are essentially 3 different types of nodes. There are pharmacies, which have a very large in degree, lots of traffic being sent to them, and they have 0 out degree. We have patsies, like those EDU websites that have been compromised, which have no in degree, no one is connecting to them, but they're fanning out traffic to a lot of people. And what's more interesting is those guys. They have large in and out degree. What that means is that they are traffic brokers. They are shuffling traffic back and forth. And as you can see, there are not that many of these guys. Now, if you take these guys down, you're really going to break the structure of the graph. So there's maybe a dozen. Actually, on this graph, I'm showing 6 big redirectors. If you take these guys down, if you arrest the operators or if you shut down the sites, you're probably going to disrupt this economy quite a bit. Now, it doesn't mean that these guys are not going to open another website somewhere else, But what we notice is that those things are very long-lived. Presumably, it takes time to set up that kind of infrastructure. So if you take these guys down, you can probably do quite some harm to this online trade. So these are our conclusions. One group of affiliates seems to be dominating the online trade, but it's a fairly loosely connected group. There's no evidence of vertical integration so far, meaning it doesn't seem like somebody is running everything from the attack to the online pharmacy sales. And the conversion rates are much higher than other spamming techniques. To wrap up, you hear very often that online crime is increasing in magnitude. It's a big problem, and that's why all of us are gainfully employed. What I want to conclude with is some small message of hope. The problem seems to be getting worse and worse. It seems like there's more and more scams going on all the time. But the reason for hope is that we see in those two studies very large concentration phenomena. Take down the top 8 groups in only one-click fraud. I'm not guaranteeing that you're going to solve the problem, but you're going to really throw a wrench into this guy's plans. Shut down those traffic redirectors that we identified, and you're going to significantly disrupt, even for a short while, but you're going to disrupt, which is better than doing nothing, the online pharmaceutical drug trade. So all of this plays to the advantage of the defender. It's just that we need to have, I think, more of those high-level overviews of those connections before we can actually produce something actionable. Right? So we need to do this, I think, more and more. And with that, I'm going to conclude. Future work, well, we have plenty. We have many, many more questionable sites to browse. We are planning to do longitudinal studies, which means running that kind of things for like a couple of years and just see how the trends are changing. And that's easy to do because we already have the infrastructure in place. So we just let the scripts run and hope that Google doesn't shut us down. We want to investigate relationships with other types of fraud. And we want also to investigate relationships with traditional organized crime, which seem to be fairly tenuous, but that needs to be delved into a little bit more. And that's pretty much all I have. I actually wanted to solicit ideas in the audience, but according to the clock, you have 28 seconds to do so. So I'm just going to conclude, and thank you for your time. I don't know if we have time for questions. We're happy to answer them.